let's move on to the corporate study.
I'll stand on this side. It's probably easier to present. So again, my name is Robert Michaud. I'm a principal with MDM Transportation Consultants based in Marlborough, Massachusetts. We've had...
Excuse me, can someone turn off the wall watch? That's good.
We've had the opportunity over the past year or so to work with the community here in Weston to document characteristics of the Summer Street Quarter, and I'm going to walk through the highlights of what we've found and elaborate on some of the recommendations that I have identified that were developed, in fact, in consultation with police, fire, engineering, public works, and Traffic and Sidewalk Committee, and through a series of working meetings. The quarter study is in its final draft form, and we anticipate that it will be finalized with a series of recommendations in the near term, pending any specific comments, suggestions, or otherwise, either from this board or from town departments. The basis for this study really resides with the traffic and monitoring program and mitigation requirements that were cited for the Boston Properties facility. Those are memorialized in the ZBA decision of December 28, 2000, in which a fund of about $500,000 was set aside by Boston Properties for the explicit use in monitoring the impact of the project over time, which we discussed earlier, and subsequently to, at the discretion of the town, to apply those funds to address specific roadway needs, improvements, or otherwise that would be related to those impacts. We know through that monitoring program, we've got a series of 4 monitoring reports that have been published and reviewed by our office, that there are in fact distinct and quantifiable impacts of the Summer Street Quarter. And those are attributed to the growth in occupancy of the Biogen IDEC building. And what's interesting is that there are also impacts to the west of Summer Street, undoubtedly, which we'll quantify in a moment. On a percentage basis, those impacts tend to be pretty significant on Summer Street because you have the added influence of how Summer Street is located along the 128 corridor. So the trend that we see for Biogen IDEC isn't particularly, it's a common trend for other area employers, we suspect, that if there are incidents or occurrences on 128 that make it congested, that this is a convenient bypass to that. And whether it's Biogen IDEC or other employment centers in Waltham, for instance, or Weston. So we talked about the Biogen IDEC trip activity earlier as generating just under 400 total trips over the course of an hour. In the morning, the distribution of those trips tends to be oriented more so toward 128, but a significant portion, about 31%, is oriented to from the west of Route 20 and have direct and immediate consequences to public travel within the town and on local street systems. Over time, that has been documented to range from, in 2011, 11 vehicles that would be generated along Summer Street onto Route 20 again, climbing or doubling to 20 in 2012, and about a 50% increase to 30 in 2013. So there's a distinct and climbing trend in the use of Summer Street for that particular land use. From an overall volume perspective, that represents nearly 1 of every 10 employees that are traveling to that site using Summer Street. It's a significant trend. The total amount of trip activity on Summer Street, if you were traveling in the morning toward Route 20, is about 130 or 240 vehicles over that hour. So about nearly 20%, or 1 of every 5 vehicles that travel on Summer Street during that commuter hour headed to Route 20 is a Biogen IDEC employee.
Can I just ask, how do you verify that? You like flash their license plates?
How do
you know?
The monitoring reports that Boston Properties is obligated to submit to the town have a license plate survey that quantify exactly which vehicles
Are
make
gonna
that
turn
movement.
into-
So you can match up.
So
license
you can
plate.
actually figure out where they're going.
Yeah.
But you're only talking about one car, for all on Summer Street, one car per minute.
Well, exactly.
You're not talking a lot of traffic.
These are the numbers for Biogen.
No, but you're talking now for Biogen, you're talking like 30 cars over 2 hours, which is 120 minutes.
No. This is per hour.
That's 30 cars per hour
Per
or
hour.
2 hours?
Between these hours,
That's 2
between
hours.
7 o'clock and 8 o'clock in the morning, over a 1 hour period, for 7 to 8 and 8 to 9, you're going to see that.
So 60 vehicles.
Correct. Right. So
it's still that's one car a minute.
Right.
You're not talking about a lot of traffic.
As I proceed into the presentation of conditions for Summer Street, it will become apparent that there is an influence from this particular employer, but there's a likely trend that over time will be rather significant. And we can talk about what I call traffic fluctuations on Summer Street. We've had the opportunity to manually and mechanically count activity, and you'll see that there's a fairly wide variation in activity.
Peter, if you don't mind, let him finish the
Okay,
presentation.
go ahead.
He'll have plenty of time to talk to you about it.
So that's quantifiable impact from Biogen IDEC. To provide some context to the study, we know that there's certainly the situation of having substantial congestion, irregular congestion on the 128 corridor. We know that there is more than 10 million square feet of planned growth to occur along that same corridor.
You're talking the Explorer plant area, right?
Correct. Right. So Polaroid and others, we'll get in that in a moment. We know that that level of growth is likely to create what we call a traffic spreading issue. And so commuter hours that have traditionally been associated with a 7 to 9 a.m. period are now extending anywhere from 6 in the morning till 10 in the morning as a result of this congestion. And certainly that has a definitive localized impact on the 2020 quarter as these congestion issues become more problematic when 128, those problems radiate into local communities. So here's a context board that would indicate the 128 corridor right here, 117, Route 20. So 180,000 vehicles a day are today using the 128 corridor. It's one of the most heavily traveled corridors in the state. Route 20, 33,000 per day. It's at its capacity. Its carrying capacity is currently it's at 95%. Route 117, 17%. So
Route 117 is what percent?
117 is 17,000 vehicles per day. It's not quite, it's about half the volume of Route 20.
Yeah. What's its capacity? Is it close to like 90%?
No, I think.
Seems like it is.
If you look at particular locations along the corridor that might, traffic signal or a difficult intersection and the capacity is constrained, it will have an influence on other portions of the corridor. But on a quarter-wide basis, it's not nearly as congested or near capacity, so to speak, as say Route 20. These are all of the developments in the area, in the region, that will be contributing over time to additional traffic in the area. Some 13 million square feet of development will be converging in this area over the next decade. We know, having studied in prior evaluations of 128 corridor, 20 corridor, and 117, and in fact, the Mass Turnpike corridor, that these are approaching capacity or are currently at or operating above capacity.
Totally a failure. Nowhere to go.
Yeah, any slight fluctuation in traffic is going to create an issue and a rippling effect. So this is a good pictorial that would indicate, in a very generic way, where most of the roadways here, Route 20, 128, Mass Turnpike, they're at 90 to 95% capacity right now during most of those commuter periods. And any variability in that, whether it's an incident event, a weather-related event, a breakdown, someone getting stopped for a speeding ticket, you've got rubbernecking and other factors that are happening, creates a situation where you're actually going to exceed that capacity. So those are conditions where you're going at 40, 50, 60 miles an hour and you see the back of that queue and you literally stop, and there's an accordion effect, and you can be in traffic for quite a while. It can double your commute time, etc. And that's not an uncommon event on 128 in particular. With the 13 million square feet of growth in the area, the likelihood that there'll be more events like that goes up, in simple terms. So how does that relate to the Summer Street corridor? We looked at this 1.5 mile section of road and both of its gateways, right? The Route 20 gateway or connection here and the River Road gateway here and everything in between. And we've identified 3 distinct segments of the road that have distinct characteristics based on travel speeds. And so if you look at the upper portion of the corridor, it is posted as a regulatory speed limit of 20 miles an hour. The central section, we'll call it, is 25 miles an hour, and the most southerly section is 30 miles an hour. So distinctly different characteristics for each of those. If you look at some of the geometric characteristics starting at the Route 20 side, right? This is Route 20 right here, right? That's 128. So starting at this gateway, Route 20 and Summer Street, you'll see that there is regular congestion that occurs at the merge point of the 2 lanes, right, where it comes down to being a single lane. We'll talk about that in a moment. That's an important characteristic that is front to center in one of our recommendations. As you proceed further along Summer Street, you'll see that the geometry is curved, narrow, objects, trees, poles, posts, walls, very close to the roadway edge. And what that does is it really constrains the available or the effective travel width of the road. So in sections, for instance, that might only be 18 feet, 19 feet paved, that have obstructions right to the travel edge, the psychology of the driver is to stay a certain distance away from these objects.
We call them traffic cones.
Yeah, and interestingly, you think that those types of features would have a direct influence on travel speeds, but in fact, they don't in this case. It's very interesting.
Wow.
Yeah. But they certainly lead to crashes and incidents hitting fixed objects, and it's very easy to see. If you look at some of the vegetation, the trees, you'll see that many of them have bark removed from being hit either by side mirrors or fenders and bumpers. So this upper portion, very, very constrained geometrically. Sight lines are poor, particularly along the very first curved portion of Summer Street. That's particularly problematic for larger type of vehicles, emergency response vehicles, other commercial vehicles that use the corridor. As you proceed to the central section of the corridor, the widths become a little more generous. You still don't have a whole lot of shoulder area to deal with, and there are still fixed objects, but certainly it's deserving of a slightly higher speed limit, which it has. And then you proceed to the lowest portion, most southerly portion of Summer Street, and it is pretty much wide open where it's directly paralleling 128. Its width is actually excessive in some areas. So very distinct, 3 distinct segments here. From a traffic volume perspective, we know that the road carries just under 2,000 cars a day. Right? So it's not an extraordinarily high volume roadway. And for the folks who live along the roadway, they may stand at their mailbox or be eating at the dining room, and you'll see traffic activity on the order of about 200 vehicles per hour, which is equivalent to about 3 vehicles per minute. So from a qualitative perspective, isn't like conditions on Route 20 or 117. It's a relatively modest volume, but you'll see in this diagram where there are 2 distinct peaks that are associated with commuter travel or school-related activity. There's a series of bars here that are shown in orange, Those represent conditions in which something happened on 128 in particular, where folks use Summer Street as a convenient bypass to get around those incidents. And we've documented on at least 2 separate occasions, visually, we've actually counted this and quantified it, that I think this was on a Thursday in May, May 31st, 2012. There was an incident on 128, and the volume that ordinarily would have been about 180 vehicles per hour jumped out by 100 cars an hour. Right? So you got a 30% increase, I'm sorry, 50% increase in traffic on Summer Street as a direct result of that type of an incident occurring. Same here, where at 6 o'clock at night, 6 to 7 o'clock, you usually only have 100. That number was 200. So pretty significant influence, and that's just from what happens on 128. It does not include the added pressures that are placed in Summer Street from area development, like Biogen IDEC, that are likely to generate some percentage of their employment as a trip along that corridor. In the case of Biogen IDEC, 1 of every 10 employees. It doesn't take long for other employers as they build out and occupy buildings in the area to likely have the same type of effect on the same corridor, in addition to this type of trend. From a speed perspective, we put specialized radar recorder equipment at several segments of the road, and what this shows is the speed trend, beginning with the northerly portion of Summer Street here and working toward the south, where this section is posted as 20 miles per hour. The 85th percentile speed on that corridor is exactly 10 miles an hour higher than that. Right? So you've got it's 30. So people are traveling at a fairly high rate of speed in a very geometrically constrained area with limited sight lines and roadside obstructions. The central section, which is posted at 25 miles an hour, has 85th percentile speeds of 36 miles an hour. Okay? As you go to the 30 mile an hour section, the 85th speeds are in excess of 40 miles an hour. So consistently, regardless of which segment we're in, we're seeing about a 10 mile an hour speed violation at each one of those sections, regardless of how narrow or constrained it is. And that raises concern from a safety perspective, certainly. And over time, as traffic variations occur and as increased dependence occurs on Summer Street, that becomes more and more problematic. We took a closer look at incident characteristics beginning at the gateway. This is the Route 20 and Summer Street intersection. We obtained through the police department a series of individual crash records to identify trends. And what's interesting about this particular trend is as you're traveling past the Biogen IDEC site, you're transitioning from a 2-lane section to a 1-lane section in a rather abrupt length of road. It doesn't fully meet design criteria based on the speeds on Route 20. As Chief Shaw had mentioned, I think you'll see incidents, side swipe type collisions occurring at that transition from the 2-lane to the 1-lane section. You'll also see rear-end collisions occurring that are a direct result of folks that are attempting to make left turns but need to wait for a gap in traffic. Vehicles attempt to bypass those vehicles and sometimes aren't successful in doing that. And so you've got 2 primary incident trends. You've got side swipe type collisions that are occurring in the merge, and you have rear-end collisions occurring at the interface with the left turn in your Summer Street. We also document, just for reference, what we anticipate the future traffic levels will be along the corridor. That does not include the specific impacts of the 13 million square feet of space. It's very hard to quantify exactly what's going to happen with that kind of space. But we know that today the capacity on Route 20 is substantially constrained. That the directional flow in the morning outbound toward 128 is about 1,500 cars an hour. 1-lane capacity if it has no obstructions or impediments, like driveways or side streets or signals, is about 1,800 cars an hour. All right. School Street signal, the Summer Street connection, the Biogen IDEC signal, all constrain or result in queues and congestion that occur on the Route 20 corridor. And so, under future conditions, we anticipate using simple growth assumptions that 1,500 cars per hour jumps to between 1,600 and 1,700 per hour, and will push you much closer to that breaking point, so that any interference from a side street for a signal will make that congestion worse. And that's essentially just pictorial of the volume conditions. We don't need to talk about specifics quite yet on that. So really, the key issues of the study relate to, first and foremost, the impact of operations at the Route 20 gateway of Summer Street. We know from looking at incident records, observations, et cetera, that is a major safety concern, and it directly influences the capacity along the corridor. We know that the Summer Street corridor is subject to substantial volume fluctuations. It can go up and down by 50% on any given day. And that type of fluctuation is likely to increase in frequency over time as development occurs along the 128 corridor. We know that the corridor is subject to high travel speeds, well above posted limits consistently. We know that the geometry is constrained between 20 and Greystone Lane in particular. And we know that in the southerly sections we have almost the opposite problem, where the roadway width is so wide that it further probably encourages higher travel speeds. And that's certainly problematic, as that serves as a gateway to the residential community that exists along that corridor and the Meadowbrook School. So we've identified, again, through a series of meetings with departmental staff, emergency responders, et cetera, that we've come up with a series of recommendations we think may be appropriate to consider for the corridor. They include gateway improvements at Route 20 and Summer Street, traffic calming measures along the Summer Street corridor, traffic monitoring and enforcement considerations, and the potential for heavy commercial vehicle exclusion on that particular corridor. I'll walk through each one of those. So this is the condition that I mentioned earlier at the Route 20 Summer Street intersection. This is the westbound Route 20 alignment. You'll see that there are 2 lanes here. That right turn lane ends rather abruptly. My recollection is that the actual length in which you have to transition from 2 lanes to 1 is about 400 feet. Industry standards based on the speeds we know exist on Route 20 is really about double that. All right? So that's creating an issue, certainly with the merge. And you'll see that as people are attempting to make left turns, this is the opposite view. This is a vehicle trying to make a left turn into Summer Street, that there's really no other lane in which to accommodate a car. So cars that want to bypass that queued vehicle really need to use this limited shoulder area to do so. And that is leading to rear-end collisions at the intersection. How that relates to a recommendation is we would suggest it's appropriate to take the 2-lane section, which is located along this segment right here. This is the signal and Biogen IDEC, and to widen out Route 20 sufficiently to extend that 2-lane section up to and including that intersection in summer, and then to transition that 2-lane section to 1 over an appropriate distance of about 800 feet. There is sufficient roadway width, public right-of-way to do that. It could be designed so that it's fully compliant with Mass DOT safety criteria. It would have the benefit of allowing vehicles who are queued and attempting to make a left turn to do so in their own lane, with the ability for anyone behind them to bypass in a dedicated lane. Right? If you're a bicyclist along this corridor, and we've documented that there are bicyclists along this corridor, today's condition is tenuous at best. While there is a roadway shoulder on this edge, in the prior photo, it's not a very generous shoulder. Eventually, that does get wider, and Mass DOT current policy is to have between a 4 and 5 foot wide shoulder for proper accommodation of bicyclists. So we don't like what we see here. It's pretty clearly documented. It's been an issue, and this type of an improvement can certainly address that.
The widening that would take place,
Yes.
it wouldn't borrow completely from the north side, would it? It would have to grow, in other words, on both sides.
It can be achieved in one of 3 ways. You can either attempt to widen on the north side of the road, but there's a sidewalk on that edge, and we understand that there's a preference from the town to have a grass buffer strip located between the roadway edge and the sidewalk. So this plan would have that widening occur primarily on the south side. Now, there are a series of telephone poles on this edge, which become a cost consideration. So you could actually design something that hits the middle ground, that allows for the widening to occur, avoiding the poles, but still retaining some amount of grass buffer strip. And that's what this plan shows.
Can I make a comment on this?
Can I make a comment on it, too?
On this specific,
Yes, specific.
Sure.
The comment that I want to make is that if you build that lane, the whole purpose is trying to keep people off of Summer Street. If you build that lane, it would actually encourage people through Summer Street. So the traffic committee is actually not necessarily in favor of building a turning lane which would increase traffic on Summer Street.
In other words, you're providing an easier route.
Right.
It's the
So
fact
now
that
you're
it's
giving
difficult.
people an incentive to make that turn.
Right, this is the paradox. In other words, we're providing something. But of course, this has to be seen in the context of the accident reports that we're seeing.
And I don't think there's that much accident you want to understand.
You and I talked about it.
The actual rate of incidents is somewhere around average, but there's a very distinct trend. And although there's only an average crash level, it's really being driven by the volume that's being used to develop that rate. So the number of crashes on an annual basis is significant, and the 2 distinct crash types are highly indicative of a need to do something there. Right? Now, to address the issue of whether that improvement would increase capacity or desire to use Summer Street, that's not a capacity enhancement for Summer Street. If you want to make a left turn onto Summer Street, you're going to be in the same lane that you are today, waiting. What this allows is the proper bypass of the vehicle, and more importantly, the proper transition from a 2-lane section to a 1-lane section over a given length. So this
Can
is
I
a
make a
safety.
comment on this?
That's a safety improvement.
I would do exactly the opposite. I turn into Route 20, into Summer Street from Route 20 a lot more than probably anybody in this room. The problem is not the constriction on the right-hand side. The problem is the fact that people are coming so fast. What you need to do is to slow the people down closer to the Biogen IDEC driveway so that they're going slow, because what happens is people are going like that, but they're coming 30, 40 miles an hour to do that. If you slow them down to 25 or 30 before they get to the Summer Street intersection, then they won't be going so fast, and then they won't have to cut off the person behind them or endanger the person that's trying to turn left. That's what you've got to do. If you widen Route 20 there, they're going to be going faster by that intersection, not slower.
It's an interesting concept. I think as this is a state highway, it has certain design dimensions and criteria. It's an arterial
You're trying
road.
to change those dimensions by widening it.
No, actually, heck, ideally, if you really wanted to slow people down here, you constrain the width of the road so much that it made it difficult to go fast. But that's contrary to the purpose of Route 20. Right? So Route 20 is an arterial roadway. Its function is to move traffic.
Right.
And it's in conflict, I agree, with other local streets where you have a much different objective, right? So you live along Summer Street, so in your particular case, you know, your desire is to have people go slower and, you know, drive more thoughtfully. I would. But the purpose of Route 20 is not that. The purpose of Route 20 is to move traffic and to move it efficiently. So there's really no good way to slow people down. People are traveling at speeds that they're legally entitled to travel at on Route 20. The issue is that if they're traveling at those legally allowed limits, and you're only given half the amount of distance to merge to a single lane, people's reaction time has to be jacked up, you know, and that doesn't work for everybody. It may not be a problem for someone who is highly experienced and aware of this issue, but for folks who aren't familiar with the corridor, for younger drivers, for older drivers, those types of issues, not having sufficient transition length to make a movement, that's a problem, and that's why we're seeing the types of crashes that we see from the incident reports. So I don't disagree that it would be nice to have people travel slower, but the objective of Route 20 is being met in terms of how it's designed. It's just that that segment of Route 20 is deficient. It's not to current standards in terms of transition length, and that's creating a problem.
If you create more room on the right-hand side of the person that's trying to turn left into Summer Street, you'll enable people to go faster. That's the problem. That's the problem. It's quite simple.
The purpose of it was to be able to give the ability to take a left there,
Right.
without, in other words, endangering the person who's trying to take the left. That seems to be the issue that we're trying to deal with. And the second one is the fact that there is only a 400-foot corridor where there needs to be 800 feet. So you're right. I mean, their speeds might be greater than what they would be because it's a choke point. But I think the difference is it seems to be a safer corridor as a result of widening, so that you've got a dedicated left-hand turn. Now, it's a judgment call, but it is a paradox to this sort of thing. But,
Look, the problem is very simple. You can go down there, and if you park trying to go left on Summer Street, just stay there for a while as people on the planning board and watch them yourself in the rear mirror. The people come up behind you, and they're swerving to the right, okay?
Yep.
If you allow them to go faster, they're going to have to swerve faster. What you're trying to do is to slow them down behind you, not beside you, behind you.
I think the reason why people are going slower now is because it's a choke point. But the consequence of that as a choke point is you've got people jockeying for position, in other words, and they're not paying attention necessarily to the person taking the left there. So there are competing interests here, in other words. Yes, the travel might be faster as a result of that lane being free instead of being a choke point. But we have to weigh that in the context of what the benefits are. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. It's not the definition of the problem, it's a solution.
Hey, Bob, so this wouldn't be creating a third lane for a left-hand turn?
No.
No, this is, okay, so it really doesn't change, I mean, as it is right now, they pull off into that area where the white line is, you're not supposed to go over.
Correct.
And it's narrow.
Yeah.
So that's a very good point. How would extending it, if you'd still have people coming, the two of them, you know, coming barreling up and needing to merge eventually, but then there's this car right here in front of them. So now they have to still swerve if they're going a little faster.
It's a good question. If you look at how folks travel, if they're given the choice of traveling in two lanes,
Yeah.
a higher proportion of motorists will always select the lane closest to the roadway edge, unless they know that they're near where they need to turn and they're going to stay near the center line. Today, you don't have the luxury of choosing a lane and staying in that lane. You're literally coming through a signal, probably going between 40 and 50 miles an hour, depending on whether or not you stop at a green light. And then you have half the distance in which to make a determination of whether I have an appropriate spot to merge into a single lane. So folks don't have the luxury of saying, I'd rather be on the inside or the outside lane. If you're on the outside lane, you may prefer to be on that outer lane, knowing that you have the advantage of seeing someone next to you and making an easier movement into the merge. under this scenario where you have a full dedicated lane, the higher proportion of people who are traveling through this intersection will most likely be on that right lane. And anyone who's in the lane where a left turn is occurring will have to slow down, and they may not have the ability to swerve around the vehicle. They'll have to allow that vehicle to proceed.
Or they'll have to slam on the brakes and still plow into the guy who's trying to turn left.
Right, but you're
at a higher rate.
But you're you're eliminating the confusion that people are looking this way to see if they can merge appropriately or this way.
Yeah.
And they don't know if someone's stopped right in front of them. They're concerned with peripheral vision and making a decision in a short amount of time, which can I fit, right? And if I can, am I accelerating? Am I braking? And by the time you make that decision, you realize someone stopped to make a left turn. That condition goes away. And if this were approved and you were in the inner lane closest to the center of the road, you're not having to deal with this whole issue of merging. You can focus on what's in front of you, and to the extent you see someone that wants to make a left turn and they're delayed, you have 800 feet in which to make a determination. Can I see somebody? Can I get over to the other lane to bypass them? Much different scenario. You've got a lot more decision time under this scenario. You're eliminating the dual conflict of trying to find a gap and see what's going on up the street.
And we have to remember that in some cases, drivers already drive like there's two lanes.
I know they do.
Because of the fact that they maintain a high rate of speed going down the breakdown lane.
Right, because they're in the breakdown lane.
Exactly. So it is making it safer, and as Bob said, traffic calming is often the sole goal is reducing conflict points. And as Bob said, there's two that are occurring at the same.
No left turn, 3 to 6 p.m.
I'm sure the chief would love that.
but let's face it, because I still think you'll end up with a few rear ends because people may not, they're texting, they're reading,
and those are other complicated.
Yeah, I mean, it's like they're so distracted, and so, if you make it no left turn.
Right. So,
and you just kick it down to rolling.
Maybe.
And I'll say just historically that, where...
Think about Lincoln and what they're like brilliant.
Biogen IDEC, when they were in the design phase of this lane, actually originally had a plan that had even less...
Oh, I remember it. It was tiny. It was like nothing, and I think you came in and said, this is just not going to work.
Right. So we hit a middle ground given the funding constraints and where they were needing to be occupying the building. And they had an expedited review by Mass DOT for extending that lane, and they did that at their cost, to their credit. They did that. And one of the purposes of the monitoring was to identify whether or not that was going to do the trick. And lo and behold, well, it's certainly better, much better than it was originally designed. It's still substandard. It's still insufficient to address the types of crashes and trends that we see there. So that's our top recommendation. It's first of all, it benefits from a safety perspective the highest number of people by virtue of the high volume of traffic that does travel on Route 20, and it benefits the folks who may be inclined, whether they live, work, or go to school along Summer Street. It benefits them from a safety perspective as well.
Why can't you restore Route 20 back to its one lane going west at the Biogen driveway, the way it used to be? You widened the street. Somebody widened the street at Biogen IDEC so those people could take a right turn and merge into traffic. If you make it a single lane all the way back the way it used to be, then you reduce the speed. You get that merge much farther back from 2-lane to 1 lane, and that's the solution to the problem.
So if you explain that to Mass DOT, they would say that now what you created is a queue that will extend from that signal all the way into the interchange.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Better than
Yeah, there you go.
Except Mass DOT wouldn't buy that.
Except,
They just wouldn't
But
buy
it's
it.
only a couple of hundred feet
No,
that
but
you're
you'd back it
extending
up.
it.
You'd back up the exiting off of 128 southbound and Route 20. I
So
mean,
they
it would
backed
just
up.
be this.
So,
I mean, it's going to happen anyway with the how many million square feet that's going to happen.
right. So this design was long thought, long planned under an environmental review process at the state level. It involved a lot of input from the town. This is a gateway in Weston. If you can't get past here efficiently, you can't get into or out of Weston efficiently.
There's another question that ought to be asked, and certainly it's a valid question. How much reduction in accidents at that Summer Street corridor on Route 20 will be reduced if you change any configuration, and how much is just plain sloppy driving that's going to be there all the time?
Yeah, Federal Highway actually has a study out that identifies the benefits of certain improvements, including those adding lanes. Right? And I know, having just done a study and using their information, that there's somewhere around a 15 to 20% reduction in collisions that would result from this type of an improvement.
So somebody asked earlier, how many collisions are at that intersection? You said a lot. A lot is a relative term. Is it 3 a year, 4 a year? And therefore, 20% reduction results in what?
Right. So just to give
You don't have to answer the questions tonight, but those are questions that ought to be asked.
Oh, absolutely, and that's why the board is actually holding this meeting. Those are good questions, and they're in fact documented in great detail in this quarter study. Right. So
we're just so everyone knows. I have the electronic version of that, which is going to be posted online tomorrow, so that people will be able to view that report.
Right. So just to give you a sense as to how many this is related to. So between 2008 and 2004 year period, 22 crashes are shown on this diagram. Right. That's about 5 to 6 per year. That's one every other month. And many of these
Since Bargenetics been
yes, essentially. Right. And
But how
they're
many
all,
were there before?
I'm not certain.
That's why I say, I mean, this is all in a vacuum. And I still would ask the same question. How many less accidents would there be if you spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to change the intersection there?
Well, this data is not impossible to get, right? In other words, if
No,
we
you
look-
can't project the
we
future
look
like
at-
that.
No, I mean to look back at accidents that occurred prior to 2008.
We certainly we can obtain that information. I think the more salient point is that we know for the last 4 to 5 year period that this trend has been occurring, and that's a significant trend. It's very unusual to be able to pinpoint with this level of specificity the two types of crashes that occur at a very specific location.
Right.
And so as a traffic engineer, we look at that and apply, it's a significant stat. We can directly attribute it to a substandard geometry, not enough transition length, and the effect of having that impact folks who are delayed in making the left turn. So we know exactly the type and reason for incident, and that allows us to think about ways to address it.
I mean, to me, this has the potential to be like the Wellesley Street syndrome. They said, you got to widen Wellesley Street. Well, they widened Wellesley Street and the traffic speed increased, so they had a lot more accidents. And so now the town wants us not to widen streets because of the fact that you keep the speed down. And I wonder, I can't project, I'm not a traffic engineer, but I wonder if that's what will happen here. You widen the street, you have higher traffic speeds, and then you have worse accidents. So that's the risk.
We kind of did this at the intersection at Highland Street, and I mean it's different because you're not merging down into one lane where there's two, but as a turnaround to Highland Street, I feel is a lot safer. No one's going to run into me there. And the other thing I was just wondering is, did you look at the accident rates out of Gifford School, because it's really close to this?
We did not. Our focus was really on the Summer Street quarter itself and the gateways, the two gateways that serve it. Right?
The traffic committee actually wanted that turn on Highland Street. The traffic committee doesn't want it on Summer for the main reason that we feel it will increase traffic on Summer Street. And that's a very important distinction in terms of
It's more just much safer.
It's more than just safety. It's also the number of vehicles being encouraged to use that street. And that has to be taken into consideration. I mean, I don't know what you want me to talk, but the traffic committee has other priorities that I think are much higher in town than that, and not to build something that would encourage more cars onto Summer Street.
You got one vote on that one.
And we have other intersections. I mean, I'm here from the committee because all the stuff that wants to be spent on, and we have other intersections that really need a lot more work. And I've seen some of the stuff before and all this traffic coming. We like that Summer Street has all these things that slow down the traffic. We don't want, and the traffic committee is not a big fan of speed humps and speed bumps. And like he was saying, the biggest problem is Meadowbrook School. It's not so much these other things. And all these, the money that was from Biogen IDEC is not really related to Polaroid and those other places. We may ask for money from Polaroid, but this town has many other important intersections than this one.
Agreed. It's just that we're dealing with a couple of very specific issues that we're trying to address.
Right, but by addressing this turning lane, you're going to be encouraging more traffic on a street you don't want to encourage more traffic. Highland Street is a known cut-through with a yellow line down the middle of it that is meant to be a through street. Summer Street is not built to be a through street.
Right.
We put that lane on Highland Street because it's meant to be a through street. So we don't believe as a committee that we want to encourage people to make Summer a through street.
So if I can just add, because we can't come to consensus on this tonight. The intent is to have the draft presentation, to have this all out. The Planning Board and the Traffic Committee need to schedule a joint meeting to discuss this, because the Board of Selectmen is expecting a consensus recommendation to the Board of Selectmen. Both committees cannot go with their separate recommendations and drop it on the Board of Selectmen's lap.
Do we have a timeline when they want that? Or is it just open?
It's basically, the two committees need to be able to meet. And
We've been trying to meet for months.
So that's one of the things hopefully we can nail down tonight.
Okay. I mean, do we need a date certain tonight, or do
Well, that's what Peter would like to try to address something in the next month.
I mean, we've been trying for months to meet because we're not in favor of spending the money here, to be honest with you. We have bigger fish to fry in this town.
Okay, so there's 15
Yeah,
minutes
so
left.
let me go.
one of the 4 points so far.
Yeah, so that was point one. The others, I hope to go quicker. Then we focus our attention on the Summer Street corridor itself. We know one of the primary issues here is speeding, and it's not conducive given some of the constraints that we talked about. We talked about Gateway. Now, we've identified certain segments of Summer Street where there could be some form of traffic calming device that would either physically give a cue to the driver that they should be traveling at a slower speed, or a visual cue, or a combination thereof. Right? So you'll see that there's the upper portion of Summer Street just before it meets 20, just before this nasty curve. The central section has a couple of locations, one of which, actually two of which, are located near the Meadowbrook School, and then there's the wide open section that parallels 128. Right? And so the types of measures that we've identified as being appropriate and potentially effective would include speed advisory radar, for instance. Right? So these are driver feedback signs. As you're driving, the posted limit is clearly identified, and the speed at which you're traveling is clearly identified. And it's an educational tool that has been shown to be very effective in communities. I traveled through a local street in Marlborough, actually Northborough, on the way to Marlborough, where this has been implemented. And it's really noticeably reduced speeds, because people, I think, as a general rule, if they're advised that they're going much faster than they should be, they tend to meet at their speeds.
I'm just waiting because I figured there's a camera.
Yeah.
One of these days it'll get me.
Absolutely, and these actually do collect data,
Yeah,
by the way.
there you go. I knew it.
So the dual role that these have is advising a motorist. So if you're going 45, right, some folks, you're just not aware of it. If you see it right next to a regulatory sign, it sends a couple signals, right? This is being monitored. And I'm a responsible citizen. I shouldn't really be going 45, maybe 50 miles an hour in this kind of zone. And people respond to that. And the next role is that it actually does collect volume and speed information that can be a useful tool to the police, for instance, in identifying trends, whether or not certain actions are effective, without putting staff out there on a regular basis. Another element, this is a physical element, right? So this is a picture of the 128 corner immediately adjacent to that wider section of Summer Street. It's fairly wide. That tends to be an area where you have speeds approaching, in excess of 40 miles an hour, and they're approaching Meadowbrook School. Having a center narrowing island will give a visual cue that there really isn't as much width to this road as you think, or at least as a transition from what is a very wide section into a narrower section just before you get to the school. Could be used in combination with these speed humps. These are not speed bumps. They're not abrupt features that jolt you. These are wider sections, typically about 20 feet wide. They span the roadway. They're well marked with pavement markings, and they provide a gentle reminder that you should only be going a certain speed. And they're actually designed based on the speed you want to regulate. So they're parabolic shape. If you exceed a certain speed, they're going to tend to jolt you a little bit. It's an uncomfortable experience. But if you're traveling at the regulatory speed limit, you hardly feel it, right? And an example of where that's used here, actually nearby, this is Sudbury. Sudbury has a location here. There's a speed hump with speed advisory plaque in advance. Here's a closer view of that type of application. This is on a lower speed roadway. The physical dimension, this is probably about 12 feet to 15 feet. Clearly marked, advanced signs, can be a very effective tool, especially when taken in combination with these other types of measures. Now, this is not a raised element. This would be something that is stamped into the asphalt. It has a different color. It looks like an island, but it's plowable. It's maintenance-free, essentially. One of the concerns we heard from fire in particular is these elements right here. How are these going to affect their response times and their vehicles? And so I'm glad to report that these can be designed so that they fully accommodate the wheel track of those types of vehicles. And I understand that from Chief Soar that these vehicles are regularly traveling down Summer Street, usually about once a day, sometimes twice. They're going over to River Road. There's a senior living facility there that is often,
You have to send that size truck over there?
I don't.
Fire department sends that great big thing over there?
Yeah.
Yes.
It sounds good.
Right.
Very
So
efficient.
what's interesting here is that this is actually a portable unit, so to speak. The drawing I showed inferred that this would be a permanent feature. One option that the town could have here is to buy a far less expensive mat system that is literally attached to the pavement, so it's structurally sound. It's not going to lift up or fly away with the wind, so to speak. And you can only use it on a trial basis or relocate it to the extent it would be more effective at another location. You'll see that those mat systems are designed so that they can accommodate those types of vehicles as well.
It's the ambulance that you got to accommodate.
And the wheel track for the ambulance and these trucks, the width of that track opening can be designed to accommodate both.
That's what you got to.
Correct. Absolutely. And but
The
what
good news is that there's no patients in the ambulance going south because they'll lose their teeth as well as whatever else is wrong.
right. I imagine it's a hair-raising ride.
They've done this on Plain Road in Wayland. Just recently they did the mats, and now they've done the bigger, I don't know if you guys have driven on that, but they've just done
And
that.
so to the extent the town wants feedback on the effectiveness of these types of features, that's a call to the Public Works Department at a local town, Sudbury, Wayland, saying, what's been your experience? So these are ideas, they're suggestions, things to think about. These are low-cost items that could have a dramatic effect on travel speeds in particular, which is a primary concern along that road. So the next feature identifies the central and southerly portions of Summer Street where there might be a bit more roadway width than you really need, and that gives a visual cue to a motorist that they can go faster, they can travel faster. The idea here is to implement a road diet design. Right? It's a simple, cost-effective design that would physically mark portions of the road to create shoulders. Right? 2 to 4 foot shoulders along either side with a clearly delineated center line that takes this condition, right? So this is about 23 to 24 feet wide right here, and it creates 2 9-foot lanes with adjoining shoulders, and it gives visual perception of the driver that they're really in a much narrower section of road, and they tend to meter their speeds accordingly. Paint, right? Thermoplastic, or a combination of those with reflective in-pavement indicators. So it's all low-cost stuff, easily implementable, that could actually achieve the objective of reducing speeds. Third, and this goes along the lines of travel plan management, but it's a little bit more hands-on. We, through our discussions with the police department, fully understand that they can't be at every street corner every day to monitor speeds and volumes and issue tickets. This piece of equipment is one idea we're throwing out as a low-cost, potentially highly effective technological way to monitor what's happening, identify specific problem locations, and then to target enforcement. So I mentioned earlier you had those radar signs. They collect data. It's useful because they're static. You send staff out, download data, see what's going on. Are those 85th percentile speeds 10 miles an hour above what they should be after implementing some of these measures? If they are, that might warrant enforcement, periodic enforcement. Understanding manpower limitations. This is a radar recorder. It's a portable unit that could complement those feedback signs. Could be placed at specific locations along Summer Street or any other street in town where the police department has either received complaints or suspects an issue may be occurring. This is state-of-the-art equipment. My office owns some of this equipment. This is actually our box that we put out on Summer Street. It's very non-intrusive. People don't know it's there. It collects data in a report form that identifies on an hour-by-hour, minute-by-minute basis what the travel speeds are, what the volumes are, and it will actually develop through specialized software profiles, speed profiles, with certain criteria that if they're exceeded, put red flags in the report so that the police department would say, all right, we know that on Tuesdays between 3 and 6, there's a speeding issue on this section of road. They can then target enforcement and use their manpower more efficiently. So again, low cost, potentially effective means of targeting enforcement in this particular case. And finally, it became apparent to me, having traveled through the corridor over the last year and a half, and really making detailed notes about what's happening there. There's a fairly high percentage or number of commercial vehicles that use that road. We know that some of those may be school buses, they may be home delivery trucks, et cetera, but there's another component of commercial activity that relates to truckers who may be using Summer Street as a matter of convenience to not have to get onto 128. They may not have a destination along Summer Street. They may have a destination in Wayland or from Wayland to Weston or vice versa.
Meadowbrook School.
Well, we're talking about, we understand Meadowbrook is a destination along the corridor.
The food trucks that are going to Meadowbrook.
Correct. So we know those exist, and the road is not ideal to accommodate those types of logging vehicles. Absolutely understood. There's a provision in state law that would allow the community to implement what's known as a heavy commercial vehicle exclusion. Would not apply to school buses. It would not apply to your Jordan's furniture delivery truck or commercial vehicles that had a destination along the corridor, landscaping truck, etc. It would apply to vehicles that have no business along the corridor, and there is actually a sign posting on both sides of the street in this case that would say heavy commercial vehicle exclusion, truck exclusion. It would give the police department a tool to enforce, this type of activity. If commercial activity was observed to be ramping up, and it had nothing to do with the Summer Street corridor, it would give the police department the ability to take it and enforce. It's easy to implement. I believe that in the context of Summer Street, it would be approved by the state, but it's yet another means of trying to temper the volume and the type of vehicle, particularly larger vehicles that use the road. So that's the range of improvements. This is a snapshot of cost. One of our charges was to identify potential costs for each of these, including design. First, the most expensive and potentially the most substantial safety enhancement improvement is that gateway at Route 20 in Summer. We anticipate that the construction value of that is about $250,000. That the design component is somewhere around $45,000 for a total of planning purposes about $295,000, just under $300,000. The remaining elements are all far less expensive. Speed advisory radar, about $7,500 to actually implement them on a per location basis. We expect you could apply this to approximately 6 locations along the corridor. That would make sense from our perspective. Very small design permitting fee to place the equipment, to identify appropriate locations for sightline purposes of where the equipment should go. So for $60,000, you could have up to 6 locations. Those are very, very effective and have been well used in local communities. Third, the speed humps, the center narrowing islands. If you were to do a physical improvement of that, literally paving, thermoplastic markings, multicolored flush islands, we're talking about a $15,000 cost per location, $5,000 to design and permit those. We assume that if you apply those at 2 locations, that would be $40,000.
But none of this addresses the key issue on Summer Street right now for the town, for the police, the fire, particularly the ambulances and the residents. And that is, what happens to the safety issue if you repave Summer Street? My wife says she doesn't want to repave because it's so bad, so many big potholes, that people have to go slower. And I'll make a recommendation. If you're going to put those machines in, put them at Ann Leibowitz's house and our house. No, I'm serious, because that's where you go on up the hill and around the curve.
There you go.
And that's where the traffic, where the pavement is bad. So if you put it in her house and our house, you'll see how fast people come north around the curve and down the hill, and how fast people go up the hill and turn right in front of our house. And that's about a 200-foot span.
Right.
And you get both the traffic count and the speed.
Right. And that's exactly the intention of that type of device, is to advise people, particularly in advance of a curve, for instance, or a sensitive lane use of the school.
But what happens if you fix Summer Street so that it's in the same condition as the northern part from Cedar Street on?
Right.
Do you get increased speeds?
You know, it's an anomaly to me. I couldn't believe how fast people were traveling on sections of Summer Street that are only 18 feet wide with blind corners.
And trees on both sides.
And trees on both sides. So what that indicates to me is that the folks who are traveling at those speeds are very familiar with the road.
Right.
And they're comfortable enough that they say, the chances of me coming on head-to-head are pretty slim at a particular time of day, and they feel comfortable going that speed.
Well, what happens if you repave it, which you've got to do at some point?
Yeah, I suspect it's really a public works question.
But what about the safety issue? You're the safety traffic person.
They're absolutely, and it's kind of there are traffic engineer jokes about this, but they actually sell decals that look like potholes, and they actually put these on roads, and they've been shown to reduce speeds because people think they're going to follow them into a canyon. Now, what's interesting in the case of Summer Street is that I suppose people are so familiar with it that they know exactly where the potholes are. That doesn't seem to influence people's behavior. But
you do get people swerving around potholes in the opposite lane.
And that's the safety
that's
issue.
what happened to my wife.
And that's the issue, is that those types of issues do need to be addressed for a safety reason, right? Completely repaving the road may not be required. There may be a need for spot treatment along the road. The higher concern issue I would have is that if you did repave, that if you made the road any wider visually to the driver, or that much easier to travel,
that's out of the question.
you're encouraging speed, right? But a spot treatment of potholes is a safety issue, and that treatment alone isn't going to necessarily magically increase
Well,
traffic.
DPW has to fill the potholes.
They do, every month or two.
Yeah, it's a common issue.
You have another question?
So, speeds are a big problem throughout the town. I mean,
Right.
it's brought up at pretty much every traffic and sidewalk committee, not just Summer Street. And as I said before, we want to use this money, this $500,000 wisely throughout the town, not just on Summer Street, because we think we have bigger fish to fry. And hopefully we can set up a meeting. Certain things, I don't think we would have a problem with heavy commercial vehicle exclusion. We've talked about it in other locations. I don't know why it costs $7,500 for a permit. But
There's a study that needs to be done and submitted to the state.
okay, well, again, that's for the traffic committee. I think we need to talk about with your committee. But the bottom line is, we think the traffic committee thinks that a lot of this money needs to be spent, considered for maybe 2 other intersections in this town, which are much more important.
I get the sense, though, that
So, I mean, that's one of the things, and why we need to go through this study.
Right.
And Bob's very familiar with the requirements of the special permit and the traffic monitoring. We need to go through this analysis. We need to identify the impact and ways of mitigating the impacts. And then it's after those things that then that money is available to be used for other things. So we have to have that discussion and provide that recommendation. It's not a kitty that says, well, let's just forget about Summer Street, let's do this.
Right.
We have to go through that analysis. And how we come out, maybe out of these, maybe we're picking 2 out of these. But we've gone through and had that conversation in order to then sort of demonstrate, well, we're mitigating the impact. And, just as people may view having a dedicated or another lane that can take a left onto Summer Street, how some people may view that as increasing the attractiveness of Summer Street. In my mind, I'm thinking it isn't. It's keeping it the same. So we have, both groups need to sort of come together. And unfortunately, when we tried to get together before, we're right on the heels of special town meeting.
Right.
And now we're coming up on the heels of the annual town meeting.
Our next meeting is
But-
February 26th.
But one of the things I think also is important for Bob to maybe chime in on is, does any of this really impact in light of what's happening with Monster.com and their report, the monitoring that will come out in the fall? Is there a timing issue that it doesn't really matter, that really the distribution isn't going to have much of an impact on this, or is it something that realistically we should be sitting down with Traffic and Sidewalk in November next year, once we have this new data with Monster.com having moved in?
It's certainly, there's a potential that the splits, the distribution of Monster employees might be different than they're projecting now. I think the approach they've taken is a reasonable one. They actually have zip code information for all of the employees at their existing facilities. And there's a likelihood that that's a good indicator, a good basis to say, yeah, we think the distribution is going to be much higher than 128. I looked at that data, I didn't see any anomalies, and I do recognize that some of those employees live west of this property and will use Route 20 to get here. But it's certainly, from my view of the employment information and how it's geographically distributed, it does not have any greater favor or deference to the west than it does to the east. So it's a short way of saying my prediction is that the numbers at the end of the day are going to be very consistent to what we've already had documented in September, and potentially a slightly higher shift to 128. And so the findings that we have here, I don't believe will be materially different under that scenario. Could be wrong, until we actually see the results, we won't know for sure. But what if it were higher to the west? What if? That would simply put more emphasis on our finding that the dependence on Summer Street is going up. Maybe instead of 30 cars an hour, it's 40, or 45, or 50. But it's not going to change any of what we've just presented. It's simply going to illustrate that over time, Summer Street is going to be subject to higher fluctuation and higher impact. That said, Joe's absolutely spot on. The basis for this study resides in the special permit decision that was granted for Boston Properties. The town is obligated to take the monitoring reports, evaluate the outcome of those reports, and to identify the appropriate use of monies as it directly affects and influences Summer Street and Rolling Lake. Those are the first two objectives. And once you get past that evaluation,
Right, absolutely.
whatever's left over, and it's really just up to the town, they can use.
Well, it's open to interpretation, how much is relevant if, like, 30 vehicles is it worth spending $500,000 for 30 vehicles? So, there's that gray area. And
Right.
The traffic committee is of the opinion that it's not that significant and the money could get, and I've spoken to a number of people on Summer Street, and they said that traffic's not bad. So it's really a question is when we can move on and when we can start using this money for other things in town that also are effective.
Wait a minute, is this money general purpose money, or is this strictly for the defined area?
It didn't specifically say,
Well,
I've read the document, it doesn't say it only has to be used
Yeah.
for Summer Street.
Really? Okay.
I was involved in the negotiations with Boston Properties back then as a neighborhood association, and some of the documents that I recall, and maybe you've got copies of them, refer to Summer Street as a priority and Rolling Lane first.
Right.
And then beyond that.
Right,
it's-
exactly.
General town.
Yeah,
Right,
right.
It
but
is,
that doesn't
it is
mean
open.
that doesn't mean that just the money's there that you have to, because it's there, you need to spend every dollar and put 6 signs up on the street.
I understand that, but you have to look at these first. I think it's the
No.
idea, the original.
Well, we have to come
original
to
agreement.
a conclusion between all the committees and find something that's workable and satisfies the Summer Street residents and satisfies the town.
So we're going to have to start moving on.
Yeah.
So final comments.
Just one of the last things is that with Peter, I know you mentioned about end of February. One of the things is because we do have some Summer Street residents that are interested, it would be nice maybe we can find a night where maybe both boards don't have a meeting, because then you start running into time constraints with business at the end. And then there's also other business such as Brown Road Sidewalk, because that's a scenic road that it would be nice to have a general conversation. So maybe an off week of what we are meeting and maybe another night for you, maybe we can throw around some dates to see what could work.
Okay, absolutely. Just throw them around, we'll bring them to the committee.
Great. So I'll end on that point. I look forward to coordinate further with the town, and look forward to the upcoming coordination. Thank you.
Thanks, Wayne.
Thank you.
None of us are going to need a license.
You go.
Can we do some of that?
Not gonna have to hold on to that.
That's the issue.
No steering wheel.
No.
No.
I think your conclusion is perfect. Very little money. We could get a lot of Summer Street people. First of all,
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just clear this stuff up.
If you could grab that.
That's great. That's what I was. So, 65, my top pick.
Where that meeting is.
It's up in the land. And then David Mendelson is I could, yeah, that's like where the house is there. These guys should be
So 65.
there would be, and then, no, with 165, then after that, we still have to worry that because we haven't received the information
Am I
on the
okay
floor.
I'm on.
No, this is the first one on 65. So, yes, back in like June.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, so we're going to
And also, Kim's on standby, so she can, I'm going to call her and then just have her listen in on the presentation, and she can comment on the landscaping plan.